Hi, welcome everyone to today's Lunch and Learn. I'm going to have Dwight present Optimizing Your Tableau Workbooks. Again, don't forget to take the survey. So Dwight, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Sounds great. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Listen, thanks for taking the time out for this Lunch and Learn. Really appreciate it. Tawana has already encouraged everyone to take the survey. It really does help, I will say that, or improve not only presentation skills but content and that sort of thing. So would appreciate that. Okay, so today we're starting today's session, or Lunch and Learn session, is the first a 5-part series on optimizing your Tableau workbooks. I'm not sure whether anyone is interested in the topic, but I can promise you that the next set of sessions will be definitely informative to everyone that joined with respect to creating your Tableau workbooks. Before we get started, an opening comment that I would make is that after spending 20 years with business intelligence, various intelligence software titles, one thing I can say about Tableau is that it is the best tool, the best software title I've seen so far that would help anyone, technical or non-technical, get started with insight into their data, seeing and understanding their data. I think Tableau does a phenomenal job at that. One of the things that I have also seen in my Tableau work for a number of different companies is that while that is true and getting dashboards produced has a very low learning curve and it can happen relatively quickly, one of the things that continues to be sort of a challenge is really understanding how to, once you have a dashboard that you're pleased with and you're happy with, how to make sure that it is performing, right? Because Tableau sort of has a number of selling points, one of which is, listen, you don't need anybody. You can connect to any data you have access to and see it all in Tableau. All right, that's great. But it has a different selling point, and the different selling point is that Tableau is a very fast analytic engine. And so with their proprietary language, it allows you to visualize millions and millions and millions of rows of data very quickly, especially I think those of you, thank you very much. Especially compared to traditional BI tools. I mean, it gets you up and running quickly and is able to visualize data very quickly in mass. And so, with that being said, the gap I think I have seen consistently is, now that I have a dashboard or a workbook that I'm happy with, or a set of dashboards, how do I make sure that they're optimized to their peak? And that's what the next 5 sessions are going to be about, okay? All right, let's jump right in. The first session is going to be foundational. It will include quite a few. We'll do some demonstrations and talk through a number of things. But the goal of this session is to introduce those of you in attendance to something known as the Tableau Order of Operations. The Order of Operations. Now, the context of this Lunch and Learn is optimizing your Tableau workbook. In addition, we'll probably touch very lightly on some topics that involve understanding how your dashboard, or why your dashboard is doing what it's doing, right? And so we'll touch on those as well. So as we begin, the order of operations, why is this important? Okay. When you connect to your data source and begin to build visualizations, and then you begin to do things like filtering, looking at top 10, sorting, aggregating, creating calculated fields and things of that nature, Tableau has an order of precedence in which it does what you're asking it to do. And And as you'll see in some of the demonstrations later, that order of precedence has profound impact on two very key areas that we're going, one of which we're going to focus on today, but two key areas. The first area is performance. How your dashboard performs has everything to do with how you design and arrange dashboards and the worksheets that make up those dashboards, and how you filter data and things of that nature. The second area outside of performance is actually, how you render the results. So, for example, I can't share with this group. Oh, and by the way, before I get too far in, if you have any questions on anything that we share, feel free to jump right in. That's the format that we're using for these lunch and learns, okay? All right. I can't tell you the number of conversations I've had with Tableau designers who have a Tableau workbook, and their desire is to create a dashboard that's sort of like, give me top 10, right? But they actually want interactivity with the top 10. And so when they add the interactivity, one of the things that catches them off guard is that the moment a user, sets quick filter, their top 10 list goes haywire. And they don't really understand why it's behaving the way that it is. Well, that's one of the other things that we'll touch on very lightly, but we're going to focus on performance. Okay, so if you scour the internet for Tableau order of operations, you'll find articles that go all the way back to 2013, 2014, to the current day. What I'd like to do is take the best of the information that I've learned about Tableau and some of the information that I've learned from some of the more prolific Tableau users and wrap it up into a nice little visualization. And this is that visualization. And I like to categorize the order of operations into two main categories, which it may be hard to read, so I'll state them out loud, and then we'll talk about these operations before we get into some demonstrations on what these really mean. And the categories are operations that take effect prior to any visualizations that you do, and then operations that take effect during the development of your visualizations. Okay? And as you can see here, we'll just talk a little bit about each one of these categories lightly, and then we'll sort of get into a demo. Extract filters, what are they? Well, when you connect to a data source, you have the data source window, right? And inside of that window, you have the option of when you create a Tableau data extract, and by extract, that's what we mean here, that word extract refers to a TDE. You can actually filter the data that is, extracted into the TDE, that makes up the TDE. That's what we mean when we say extract filter. A different type of filter from an extract, and I want to note here that they are different and they behave differently, is a data source filter. A data source filter in the data window, and we'll see that in the demonstration, allows you essentially to do the same thing that an extract filter does, but instead of determining what goes into a Tableau, data extract, it actually filters data at the original data source. Doesn't matter whether that's an Excel document, a text file, or a SQL server. Okay? Context filters are in a land of their own, although they are executed before anything else that you do in a worksheet or your dashboard or anything else you do in Tableau, which is the reason that they're listed here in order of precedence. So you can have an extract filter and a context filter in the same workbook or a data source or any combination of the three. And the reason we'll talk about some reasons why you'll do that. I do have a slide for this presentation that gives some tips. They're very high-level tips. And for those of you who maybe this is your first lunch and learn session with me, I'll just sort of give you my theory on what information I share. I don't like to duplicate, documentation that's available from Tableau. And so, the information that I'll share with you will be You'll be able to find it in other places, but it's pretty much ancillary to the standard Tableau documentation. Okay? All right, so those are pre-visualization filters, extracts, data source, and context filters. Those are done first. When I say first, what I mean is in terms of you developing a visualization and your user viewing the visualization, if you use either one of these three filters, what you should be aware of is those filters are executed and actualized first before anything else. Okay, then we have the type of filters that, you know, are specific to a visualization. And these filters happen after the previous set, as is represented here. So we have sets and conditional top-end filters, and a key point here is in addition to sets and conditional top-end filters, you have fixed LOD expressions. Now, I'm not going to, we'll have a totally different session on LOD expressions, so I would ask that if you all have detailed questions about LOD expressions, I'm going to defer them to a later session, which we'll have, I think, next week sometime or the following week, somewhere around there. So the first set of filters that is enforced when you are building a visualization is sets, conditional filters, top-end filters, and fixed LOD expressions. They happen and they will impact the data that is made available to your visualization before any other type of filter. What other type of filters? There we go. We continue down the list. Then you have dimension filters. Dimension filters are exactly what they sound like, right? You take a dimension, you drop it on the filter shelf, and you filter things like region, right? You filter out the east and the south region, so you get west and north only. That's a dimension filter. And then we have data blending. Now, this is a sort of an important point as well. So dimension filters are done before before data blending, not after. And the reason this is important, once again, is we'll talk about performance and very lightly, you know, why your visualization is performing the way that it is or doing what it's doing. After data blending, you have the rest of the LOD possibilities or types of LOD expressions, and those are include and exclude LOD expressions. And then you have measure filters. Now, what's critical to note here is that, you know, if I take sales and drop it on the filter shelf, right, it gives me one of those sliders, right? It gives you the min and max of total sales for the data that's available in the view. And I can slide the slider left or right, and we'll see this in an example. If I use a measure filter, that filter is only enforced after sets, top-end filters, dimension filters, data blending, and then any other include or exclude LOD expressions. Very important to understand that in terms of understanding what your viz is doing and then performance. And then totals, forecasts, calculated totals, and the difference here is, you know, you can use calculations or window calculations for totals, but you can also use the built-in Tableau Totals functionality, and they are different, and they happen in a different order of precedence relating to forecast or table calculations, okay? That's the difference there. So this bottom one here is if you use, like, you know, window sum or total, right? There's a function in Tableau if you create a calculated field called total. That's this. This one is the Tableau Totals, right? If you just turn on totals, if you're looking at, I don't know, a chart, right, or a graph or a data grid, a highlight table or something like that, okay? And then you have trend lines and reference lines. Those are produced last out of the order of operations. Okay, so why is this significant if you're looking at workbook performance? Number one, let's say you have 100 million rows of data, all right? And when your user opens up the dashboard, your dashboard is designed to show subsets of the data. And the subset of the data is maybe carved out by a dimension, and we'll just take region. So let's say, for example, you develop a dashboard and you want that dashboard to filter data by region based on the person, what region they're interested in. Well, you could actually take region and drop it on the filter shelf, right? That would filter data. But when you begin to do other operations like top-end filters and things like that, it's going to create a problem, which we'll see in our demo. So let's jump into Tableau and start talking about the order of operations. So I'm going to create a blank worksheet here, and we'll talk about, we'll do some examples. So let's see, we'll do category. No, I don't want category. Let's do another one. Let's do subcategory, and we'll do sum of sales. Nice little bar chart there. No problem. Everything looks good. And then what I want is from sum of sales, I actually want the top 5 subcategories. Okay? So I'm going to do top 5. Or, yeah, let's do top 5. Okay? All right. Now that looks good, right? But if I take region and drop it here so we can see across our data source the top 5 categories by sales are phones, chairs, storage, tables, and binders. Now, as I mentioned in my previous example, let's say you want this dashboard to operate in a way where the user that comes in, you want them to only be able to look at one region at a time, the region that's important to them. And so you receive that requirement, and in order to do that, you take region and you drop it here. And then you filter on central, and you show your filter so that the region, and you choose single value drop down so that they can select the region. I'm going to go back and demonstrate. So let's see, we have phones, chairs, and let's open up a notepad so we can keep track of what we're seeing here. So when we look across our data, we have phones, chairs, storage, tables, and binders, right? All right. And so you get your requirement for region, you drop region on the filter shelf, you choose one region, and then you show your filter. Now, since everyone knows that you've already communicated that these are the top 5 selling categories, phones, chairs, storage, tables, and binders, the question is, what do they really want to know? Do they really want to know sales performance for the top 5 categories only for the central region? Or do they want to know top 5 categories in the central region? So this is one example of something that sort of causes people consternation when they build their dashboards and then begin to present them. And what we're going to do is we're going to use order of operations to explain how to properly do this. And the reason there is a performance impact here is because the amount of data is filtered, right? So if we imagine for each region we have 50 million rows of data, the view that you're looking at uses all, let's say 450, that's 200. It uses all 200 million rows of data in order to process this view. But if we have 50 million rows of data per region, we really should be able to limit our data to 50 million rows of data instead of looking at 200. And the performance impact should be obvious, right? Doing a calculation across 200 million rows of data is going to be slower than doing a calculation across 50 million rows of data, period, right? Okay, so I'm going to refer back to our order of operations, and we'll talk about these 2 filters. These are both dimension filters, okay? Subcategory is a dimension filter, and region is a dimension filter. Our filter on subcategory is top 5. Our filter on region is to limit it to one region, right? So if we look back at the order of operations, here's dimension filters right here. Consider this. When you use a dimension filter, it filters the data in the view, but it doesn't filter the data. that's one of the reasons why I like when I present this order of operations graphic, I present it separating the filters that are applied to the visualizations that you build versus those that are applied to the actual data for the visualization. So back to our example, if we have 50 million rows per region for a total of 200 rows, if I use a dimension filter, I'm not filtering my data at all. Thereby, I'm not improving the performance of my workbook by limiting the amount of data at all because I'm not using these type of filters. Okay? So let's go back to our example, and let's talk about how we would do this in order to impact performance. And once again, I'm going to use something here that I'll have some tips about later. So we'll talk about, you know, when and when not to use this technique that I'm about to use later. And then we'll talk about, you know, the impact of using this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my region filter. Since we know that we only want we want to look at top 5 within Central. Okay, we want to make sure, we want to see how our top 5 is performing within the Central region. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add this to the context. Now, let me go back, and for those of you who are watching closely, I want you to pay attention to what happens here. I have subcategory, top 5 filter, and I have region, another dimension filter. When I right-click and add this to context, Tableau is going to do something with the region filter. We want to pay a close attention to that. The first thing it does is it gives you a visual cue, right? It changes it from a blue pill to a gray pill. That's number one. The second thing it does is actually puts it in the order of filters above the dimension filter. So back to our order of operations. Here's a context filter in the order of precedence, and then here's a dimension filter. Before, what was happening in our view is that our top 5 category was, and our region category, those two filters were both dimension filters, and they were executing at the same time, simultaneously. But depending on the type of dashboard you want to use, understanding the order of operations may be the way to correctly arrive at the result that you want. And so now, if we begin to filter on east, south, you know, the top 5 categories will change because of how we built the view. And here's another tip. Here's the second tip for context filters. If you're in a scenario where you have determined, based on, you know, some things that you've read, some studying you've done on context filters, or something that I share in this Lunch and Learn, where you think a context filter is ideal, tip number 1, add the context filter to the worksheet before you add anything else to the worksheet. So tip number 1 is, if you want to optimize your workbook, optimize the performance of your workbook by limiting the data when you know ultimately you have a very large data set and your workbook calls for limiting the data, and you want to use a context filter, add the context filter before you add anything else to the worksheet. So now let's do that, right? So now we have, and I'm just going to actually just blank out this worksheet. I'll drag region here, like that, and add it to the context. Now I have a context filter. I have a context filter that's added to my dashboard, and here's the significance of that. I said before that before we changed the region filter into a context filter, that it was a dimension filter and subcategory was a dimension filter, and they executed simultaneously. The reason order of operations is important is because it helps you understand, if you execute it and implement it and maybe spend time, you know, sort of understanding these order of operations, it will guarantee that what you think is happening in your dashboard is actually happening. So, for example, are we calculating top 5 based on 200 million rows, or are we calculating top 5 based on 50 million rows from the region that the user selected? A context filter allows you to do that, we've added our context filter, now we can go back and add in subcategory, add in sales. We can sort, and it's guaranteed that our sort now is being done within the context of only the central region, the region of importance to us. We set our top 5 filter, and for the central region, we now know that we have an accurate set of top 5 performers as far as sales in the central region. So chairs, phones, binders, storage, and tables are numbered, in that order. So the tip here is that when you want to increase performance by limiting data, context filters may, and this is we'll talk about this in a second slide, context filters may be a good option for you. There are sometimes that context filters actually work in reverse. They degrade the performance of your overall workbook. So my encouragement is, even though I've shown you this example, it is not intended to communicate that you should use context filters carte blanche or whenever you want to filter data, because sometimes it works in reverse. Context filters can actually slow down your dashboard, and we'll talk about those in a second. Okay, so the next example that I want to demonstrate is, what if I actually want to divide the total sales of top 5 by my total sales in general, all of my sales, right, for the entire 200 million rows. So in other words, I want to see the percentage of the chairs in the central region compared to all of my business, all of my sales business. How would I do that? Well, the first problem I have is that I got a context filter here that, is filtering all of my data. Everything is filtered out, sort of. Not sort of, but actually filtered out. If we look at the order of operations, context filters operate right here. Fixed LOD expressions, which is a way to, aggregate a number that is outside of the bounds of what's showing on the view on your Tableau worksheet. If I use a context filter, I can't use this, right? It's not going to give me what I need. And to demonstrate that, let's build a quick LOD expression. We'll do fixed, and actually, what I'll do is I'll create an LOD expression by subcategory so that, we can compare the central region's chair sales to the overall chair sales. Okay, and what we do is we call that fixed, and we're going to make it by subcategory, and what we're going to do is we're going to sum sales. Okay. Now, the purpose of this Lunch and Learn is not to teach LOD expressions. Again, we'll talk about that in a future day. But I'm going to communicate what I'm doing here. This expression, what I'm telling Tableau to do is aggregate sales per subcategory across all of my data. Okay? That's what I'm intending to do with this subcategory. And so what I'm going to do is take my new number and drop it on label, and I'll take sales and drop it on label as well. Okay? So I have my calculation on top, and I'll swap them. I have my calculation, and let's differentiate. So this is sales, and this is my LOD expression. Okay, so we can see which one is which. So I have my sales on top of my LOD expression. What you'll notice is that even though I'm filtering data by the central region, my LOD expression is not doing what I thought it's supposed to do. It's the exact same as my central region sales in every case. So it's not giving me the number that I want. The reason it's not is because I am not paying attention in the view that I built to the order of operations. So in order to do what I need to do, this context filter is being executed first. So the fixed LOD expression that I'm trying to get for my total sales is impossible for me to get because it operates on a lower order of precedence than my context filter. And so if let's go back to our dashboard, our example, we remove this from the context, you can now see that my LOD expression, you see how it's changed? It's totally different than my central region sales expression. Okay? Why is this important to performance? For some of the reasons that I've stated, and in addition, as I mentioned before, you know, if your worksheet or your dashboard or your calculations are not performing the way that you think, understanding the order of operations is sort of critical. All right, so I'll leave that example. We'll create a new worksheet. So when we talk about extract filters, what do we mean? So we're going to take a look at this, and we'll look at extract filters and data source filters. So this is basically the sample Superstore orders, right? And you can see I am performing an extract here. When we say extract filters, what we're talking about is this area right here, right? So if I put a filter on region here and I restrict it to central, essentially what's going to happen is that Tableau, now remember from my original data source, I've got all 4 regions. But from my new filter that I just added, which is an extract filter, Tableau is going to essentially send a where clause back to my data source and tell the data source, hey, listen, I only want central data, period, right? And I'm not, now remember, this is not a context filter. So in a context filter applies to the data source, you know, and it applies first before you begin to build a visualization. But a data extract filter will restrict you from even seeing the data. I'm talking about in your workbook totally. So if I double click on region now, I don't know what that's all about. Oh, there we go. If we double click on region, I only have 1 region. We know we had 4 before because in the previous example, even when I was using a context filter, I had the ability to switch regions. But with a data source filter or an extract filter, you don't even get that option, right? The data is not even available to you in Tableau. So the main difference between extract filters, data source filters, and context filters is that context filters will limit the data based on a worksheet, right, a view that you're developing. You can create a different view and have all the data available to you, assuming you haven't put in, you know, extract or data source filters that match the context filter. Extract and data source filters filter data totally. It's not even available. Anything you filter out is not available in Tableau. Okay, so let's go back to our second sheet. We're going to remove that extract filter, bring back all our data because, you know, we don't want to limit the data for our next set of examples. And when we talk about data source filters, we're talking about this area here, right? So this filter, as you might expect, is only available when you're using an extract or when you're creating a Tableau TDE. However, if you use a live connection, you can still use this filter here to filter the data that actually is available in Tableau. So if we switch that to live, my edit, right, is not available because I'm not producing an extract. That's why they call it an extract filter. And this one is the same type of filter, right? We can still filter on the central region, and when we begin to build dashboards in Tableau, that is the data that would be available to us. All right, in the context of improving the performance of your workbook, here's what I'll make a general statement about Tableau, its performance, and really trying to hit that peak threshold when it comes to your views performing. Less data is always better than more data, and I know that for many of you who probably have a background in managing and having access to data, you know, the concept may be sort of contrary to the concept of, well, I really just need all the data so I can do what I need to and not have to keep going back to the well. But if you're thinking of a high-performing workbook, the object is limit the data to only that which you need, right? And when it comes, when we enter into the realm of order of operations, that may involve actually rolling up data and bringing back less data, right? And so in our example for the 200 million row table, you know, that would play a part. All right, so let's talk about some other different order of operations. Let's choose an example. We'll bring out total sales and we'll show a filter for sales, right? This is a slider that I mentioned before that allows us to shrink and grow our sales and, you know, sort of change the upper and lower threshold of sales. Let's do it for region, and now we can sort of, you know, include or exclude regions based on what's important to us, right? All right, and let's add region to filter as well. Okay? Now, in the order of operations, dimension filters work before measure filters. And so if I show my region filter and I filter out, let's say, south and west, and I'm setting a filter here, what's important to note, and this can also work, can also contribute to the performance of your dashboard, is understanding that as far as Tableau is concerned, the region filter operates first, right? So filtering out region happens first, and then any filters that you do with dollar amounts happen second, happen after the region filter is done. So once again, the order of operations is very important. All right, so I want to jump to some tips now unless there are any questions. And now we'll bring home why understanding the order of operations is important and then how to leverage them to actually improve and optimize your Tableau workbooks. And this is an example, and I have a totally different example that we're going to walk through in this demo after we walk through these tips. So let's talk about Tableau workbook optimization tips, and what I want to focus on for this session is workbooks that have many views. When I say many views, what I'm talking about is one workbook that has multiple dashboards and multiple worksheets and multiple stories and possibly multiple data sources, okay? Understanding the order of operations and what happens when you apply certain type of operations in Tableau can have a profound impact on overall performance. So what I'm going to do is read through these, and then we'll look at some examples so that I sort of bring the text home, right? The first tip is now this is all under the context if you have a workbook that has many views in it. And I would say many views is, let's start with 20. Doesn't matter what the combination is, right? Or when I say combination, I mean a total of 20. Some dashboards, some worksheets, some stories, right? If you have 20 of these in a workbook, or maybe even 15, that's what I would consider many views, okay? So if you have a workbook like that and you want to optimize the performance, here are some tips that you should think about. Number one, if at all costs, try to avoid using the all using this data source feature of a filter. So let's take a look back at our example and see what do I mean when I say all using data source. Well, we have a dimension filter here where we're filtering out a region. I can right-click this filter and choose all using data source. Right? Now, what does this do? Now, in my workbook here, I've got, I don't know, 3 views here. Okay, I've got 3 worksheets. Now, let's take a look at our worksheets. My second worksheet just has region, and let's put discount up there. And let's see, we'll drop something. We'll drop category on color. Yeah, that's a nice little view. And then this one, let's see, we'll do this across order date. So we'll take order date, and we'll look at month and year for order date. Let's see. There we go. So I got a nice little view there. And we'll, oh, that's horrible looking. Let's go back. All right. It's a really bad view, but it gives me a bunch of small multiples. Okay? All right. So let's go back to our example of all using data source, all that use this data source. I have a dimension filter here, and the tendency that I've seen, and I'm not necessarily just talking about JLL, although I've seen it in JLL, you know, you may think to yourself, okay, you know, I've got this dashboard that's got a lot of worksheets, and I really want each one of the dashboards and the worksheets to be consistent when a user is interacting with my workbook, right? So if they filter on region, I really want that to apply everywhere so that no matter what dashboard they go to, everything is contextual, right? They're looking at things filtered by region. And so general consensus says, okay, use the all using data source. Now what that does to this filter, as you can see, is it adds a little icon here, right? There's a cylinder icon right next to our filter. It doesn't change the pill color, so the only visual cue that we have is the additional icon. If we go back, that icon wasn't there. When we chose the option to add all using, when we chose the all using this data source option, it adds a little cylinder to this view that we're working on, right? But something else is happening in Tableau, and because this Lunch and Learn is about improving the overall optimizing your workbook overall and improving performance by optimizing, I want to see what happens to the rest of my worksheets. I made this change here, but what happened to the rest of my worksheets? Oh, now look, I got another filter here with this. Well, let's go to our third worksheet. Oh, I got another filter, and it actually changed, appropriately as we thought, it changes our view. Now, here's the overall impact of this when it comes to performance. When you use all using this data source, and you have a workbook with 20 different dashboards in it, when your user requests the dashboard, specifically on Tableau Server, no one can request a view on Tableau Server and see 25 dashboards at one time. They have to look at one view at a time, right? However, because I am using all using this data source filter, in order for Tableau to load that first view, it has to process every sheet that uses this data source because I'm using this option. And so the startup cost for your dashboard is all, let's say you have 25 dashboards, it's loading, Tableau has to load all 25 dashboards before it shows the first dashboard, the one that we really want our users to see first, right? And so my first tip is that if you have workbooks that have many dashboards, try to stay away from this option. It's very expensive, okay, when it comes to performance, particularly the performance of the first view of your dashboard when users first log in. And traditionally, I'll share this with this group, usually how this happens is when we first get Tableau, we get a data source, we're really excited, Tableau is great, it does many things, and what we're doing is working through visualization ideas over time. And so dashboards just grow because, we're sort of experimenting, we're testing things out, we're making sure views are, appropriate for what we want to demonstrate, and over time the workbook grows. And we end up with this workbook that sort of has our POC work, but it also has the final state of what we want to deliver. And in the midst of that, we're teaching ourselves and we're learning Tableau features and we're reading articles and things like that. So this sort of just produces a workbook over time. My encouragement is that using this option with that type of workbook is definitely going to cause you some performance time spent trying to figure out why your dashboard is not performing. Okay, second tip, restrict the selected worksheets. Same concept, different option. Instead of applying this filter to every worksheet or every view that uses this data source, we can actually limit it a little bit, right? So we can say, okay, I want this to apply to sheet 1 and 2, but not sheet 3. Using that option over time actually has a performance degradation, because just like the all using this data source option, when you apply it to multiple sheets, the filter gets applied even though your user is not viewing the sheet. So you have to pay the performance cost for that dashboard to load, even though you're loading a view where you may be applying this filter to sheets that the user cannot see. So the basic concept is, if you want to optimize your Tableau workbook, the filters that you use on a specific dashboard, and let's say a dashboard has, I don't know, 10 worksheets on it, that's fine, but your filters should be restricted to that dashboard, okay? And so that's what this tip really means. If you're going to use selected worksheets, totally fine. It makes sense that if you have quick filters displaying on a dashboard, that every worksheet on the dashboard that that filter applied to, is impacted by a change to the filter. That makes total sense. But when it stretches across dashboards, just know that if you're doing that, it has a performance cost to your user, even though they can't see the dashboards that Tableau is processing for them, right, in the background. There's a performance cost. All right. Avoid using only relevant values. Now, only relevant values is usually in the order of operations a dimension filter. Not a data source filter, not an extract filter, not a context filter. It's usually dimension filters. And we'll do an example of that. All right, so we have category. We're going to bring out category, we'll bring out subcategory, and we'll bring out state. Yeah, I like that. And we'll show that filter, and we'll show that filter, and we'll show that filter. Okay, so only relevant values is another way, is the Tableau terminology for cascading filters, right? And so we have state, we have category, and then we have subcategory. And what we want to do is we want them to be able to select multiple values because they may want to see more than one. But what we want to happen in our data is we want these multiple values to actually be influenced by any one of the other filters, right? So what we do is we go up to our filter and we change from all values in the database to only relevant values for each one of these. And then we'll see, what that value does. And just to slow it down a little bit, here's the only relevant values. I'm clicking the chevron next to my quick filter, and I'm choosing this option as opposed to the default, which is all values in the database. All right. First thing is, every time anything that participates in only relevant values, anytime you change anything that's participating in that, it requires queries for all of the context filters. So let me state that again. We have state, category, and subcategory. If I only put only relevant values on subcategory, because state and category are on the same worksheet, are being displayed on this same view, anytime I change subcategory, all three of these queries are generated back to the data source. That's the first thing about only relevant values. The second thing is, and let's kind of look at what happens with only relevant values. So we've got three options here, and we've got, I don't know, a number of options there. So let's pick only a couple of states, and we can see how it's changing our data, and then we'll see how it's changing our categories. All right, so those categories are not changing, so let's filter this by appliances. All right, so when we filter by appliances, you know, so only relevant values are, okay, let's choose single value drop-down list instead of all values. There we go. All right, so you can see when I'm filtering on chairs, my category is limited to furniture, and my state is a couple of states here. But when I go to Arizona, I got furniture, it's not chairs, and I've got a number of subcategories here, right? Now, if we take only relevant values and then we combine that with either all using this data source or select multiple worksheets, the combination of the two is sort of detrimental to performance, okay? The reason why is that, first off, in order to load the dashboard, Tableau has to pre-calculate the unique combinations of all three of these quick filters first. I didn't say query each one and get the unique values. I said the unique combination of all three. So that means for every, let's go back to all, let's remove all values. There we go, and there we go. So for state, for every, for Alabama, Tableau has to query the unique combination of Alabama in every single category and subcategory when you use only relevant values. So you can imagine the number of queries that are being generated when you use that option. Another alternative to using only relevant values, if you're trying to optimize your Tableau workbook, is parameters, or you can use visualizations and actions, dashboard actions. They sort of do the same thing, right? So, you know, if I do a map, let's create a new worksheet and we'll demonstrate that. If I do a map by state, great, I got a map, and I double click on sales, or no, let's not do that. Yeah, let's put sales here. No, let's double click on state, and then we'll put sales on color. Right, I've got a map. All right, yeah, it's good. It's by state. And then I create another sheet that actually looks at category, and it looks at discount by category. That's a great visualization right there. All right, and then we create a different worksheet that actually takes subcategory and looks at profit by subcategory. All right, so now I've got 3 sheets, and let's add them to a dashboard, 5, 6, and 7. And if you recall, what we were doing with our only relevant values is anytime I filter on either one of these, I want everything else to be impacted, right? So an alternative to using only relevant values, which does not generate those unique queries, is going to each worksheet, using it as a filter, and you can accomplish the same thing. And you are not generating those unique queries of the overall performance of your workbook. So for example, if I click on Illinois, everything is filtered by Illinois. And it happens really fast. And there's not a bunch of additional queries that Tableau has to run in order to produce cascading filters. In other words, you use your visualizations as your filter. And then what you do in your title is, you know, click on state to filter category and subcategory. You give your users some instruction, right? So they know how to interact with your visualization. Happens really fast. Once Tableau has run this query against the data source, to interact, it never has to run another query. It runs it once, and it runs it for good. When you use only relevant values and you want to optimize your workbook, because of the order of operations, Tableau has to send queries back and forth to the data source over and over and over again. Each time it sends a query, takes time, that time degrades performance. Okay, great. Let's go to the next tip because I'm running out of time. I got 6 minutes left. All right. The next one, context filters. I mentioned, and that should actually be context and not content. So let's change that so when I pass this workbook to the team, you can see that. All right, I mentioned earlier that I would actually explain some caveats about context filters. This is where we're going to talk about that. Context filters are great. However, there's a couple things you need to know. First off, context filters create temporary tables in the data source. Now, that's not a big problem if your data source is a Tableau extract, a TDE. However, that could be a huge problem if your data source is a live data source to some back-end database. It's usually not a problem if you have a very small CSV file or text file, but if you're dealing with hundreds of millions of rows in a text file and you're using a live data source, a context filter is going to be a problem for you. The reason why is Tableau has to actually, before it renders the data to make available for you to build your visualization, it's got to build an impromptu table. That's the result of the context, right? Whatever filter you're using to create the context, it's got to create that table on the fly. The second thing you should know about context filters, which is the note here, is that if your context filters does not keywords significantly reduce the data, don't use it. I mentioned at the start when we were talking about context filters in the order of operations that sometimes context filters actually degrade performance. This is one of those circumstances. If you only have 10 rows of data, you really don't need a context filter, right? Use a data source filter. Because a context filter is a heavier or, let's say, more resource-intensive operation than a data filter, you know, you want to use them when they are appropriate. So if you're, filtering out a third of the data, a fourth of the data, that's significant. 3/4 of the data, half of the data, that's really significant. That's a candidate for context filters. If you're simply filtering out top 5 or something like that, don't use a context filter, okay? It's not worth the operation. And then as your data grows for your dashboard, that context filter will continue to increasingly degrade the performance of your overall workbook. Okay, second note about context filters. If you're using a data source that has heavy indexing, what do I mean when I say heavy indexing? This term comes from the relational data model world. It is not referring to columnar data sources that have an index on each column. It's referring to relational data sources, in particular those where you are doing a join. For example, we'll use this example. I'm going to make a connection to SQL Server, and, I have some tables in SQL Server that I want to join, so I like this, and I like that, and I want a little bit of that, and I want some of that, right? This is a relational, because I'm connecting to SQL Server, these tables have indexes on them, all of them. The sum total of what I'm doing in this data source window is something that I will refer to as heavily indexed. If you create a context filter with this data source, it's going to be really painfully slow. I mean, excruciatingly slow. So, my encouragement is, and this, sometimes may require a little bit of knowledge about the data source if you're not familiar with the data source. But suffice it to say, if you're connecting to a relational data source and you're doing a join on multiple tables, I think it's fair to assume that those tables are heavily indexed, especially if they're large tables. And I know that, a lot of you use the red data warehouse, and so this would fall under that category. Okay? All right. Even if you're doing an extract with a context filter, it can be resource intensive just to produce your extract. All right? So you want to sort of be leery and be cautious about just using context filters because they're with that gray pill color on the worksheet. Okay? All right. Well, I think that concludes today's Lunch and Learn. I want to really thank everybody for joining. This workbook will be available. All of the worksheets that I produced in here, you can go in and, chop them up to your heart's content. I provided a couple of links in this workbook. The video also will be available afterwards. So I know I talked pretty fast. There's a lot to share, and I've only scratched the surface with the order of operations. But hopefully something I shared was helpful to some of you, and appreciate your time. Thank you very much, Tawana. I am done.
Thanks, Dwight. Much appreciated.
Yep.
Thanks, guys, for joining. Have a good day.